Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Xavier Salomon, Peter J. Sharp, Chief Curator here at the Frick Collection. It is a great honor this evening for me to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Andrea Bayer, from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Dr. Bayer has worked at the Metropolitan since 1990, when she arrived there as Senior Research Assistant in the Department of European Paintings. Her role in the department has developed and grown, and in 2007 she was promoted as full curator. Her role in the museum has been a vital one, and she has collaborated closely with the Director's Office on several important projects for the museum, and was interim head of education between 2008 and 2009. Dr. Bayer has published widely and lectured in the United States and in Europe. She has taught courses and seminars in many art, including the Institute of Fine Arts here in New York, Barnard College, City College of the University of New York, and Princeton University. She studied at Vassar College, Columbia, and Harvard, and received a PhD at Princeton with a thesis on Brescia after the League of Cambrai, Moretto, Romanino, and the arts. Many of her outstanding and memorable exhibitions at the Metropolitan Museum have focused on Renaissance art from the north of Italy, and specifically on the cities of Bergamo and Brescia. Among the exhibitions curated by Dr. Bayer, highlights include the magnificent one on Dosso Dossi, court painter in Renaissance Italy, which took place between Ferrara, Los Angeles, and New York in 1998-99. I definitely remember this exhibition as one of the most beautiful exhibitions on Renaissance Italian art that I've ever seen. The still lives of Evaristo Baschenis at the Metropolitan in 2000 and 2001. Painters of Reality, the legacy of Leonardo and Caravaggio in Lombardy, which took place between Cremona and New York in 2004. The magnificent Art and Love in Renaissance Italy, which was at the Met and at Fort Worth at the Kimball Museum in 2008 and 2009, an eye-opening exhibition for all of us who saw it. And most recently, the small but splendid Bellini, Titian, and Lotto North Italian paintings from the Accademia Carrara in Bergamo, which took place at the Metropolitan in 2012. It is a particular pleasure to introduce Dr. Bayer tonight, as I believe this is a first lecture in her new and very prominent role as Jane Wrightsman Curator, the most senior title in the Department of European Paintings at the Metropolitan Museum. Congratulations, it's a really great achievement. This evening, she will lecture on the court portraiture in the age of Isabella d'Este, and will place Parmigianino's enigmatic and marvelous Schiava Turca in the Oval Room within a larger context of portraiture at the Italian courts in the Renaissance. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrea Bayer.
Good evening, everyone. I want to thank Xavier Salomon, Denise Allen, and Amy Eng for the invitation to lecture this evening, which provided an opportunity for me to revisit and think further about some issues in late 15th and early 16th century portraiture that have been of interest to me for the past years. It was wonderful to do so, knowing that my audience would have had the opportunity to see such great examples of Italian portraiture in the current exceptional installation here at the Frick. In her subtle and thought-provoking presentation of Parmigianino's compelling portrait, known as the Schiava Turca, or Turkish slave, a title mistakenly given to the work by a cataloger in Florence in 1704, Amy Eng has brought to our attention all of the visual details through which the artist defines the sitter's character, interests, and fashionable position in society. This despite the fact that we can only speculate about her identity. She has shown how the woman's dress, its partlet, the bodice, sewn with gold thread, large elaborate sleeves attached below the shoulder, lacy cuffs, and decorative apron recall that of Parmigianino's equally well-dressed Antea, another fashionable beauty painted in northern Italy in the 1530s. Her subtle pose, in which the artist avoids strict static frontality by twisting her torso, neck, and head in space, and thus suggesting motion and vital energy, is a natural outcome of a development first seen in works by Leonardo da Vinci, such as the portrait of Cecilia Gallerani. She was the mistress of Ludovico il Moro Sforza, which was painted some 40 years earlier in Milan. The fabulous headdress, or balzo, was worn by ladies throughout northern Italy in the 1520s and 1530s. Here you see two worn by courtly musicians in a painting by the Lombard artist Callisto Piazza, painted around 1530, that show you also how varied these headdresses could be in design. All of these details help us to broadly situate the painting. Northern Italy, 1530s. But they've been further clarified in the catalog, and three are particularly telling. While many women are shown holding fans, the frothy ostrich plumes set in an ivory handle seem especially important to this sitter, and may suggest a poetic wordplay in which piume, or feathers, are interchangeable with the word pen, as when the poet Lucia dell'Orto Bertani wrote that the ancient poets Sappho and Corinna rose to the lovely light of the heavens by means of dotte piume, or learned pens, but playing on both meanings of the word. Likewise, the fabulous white enamel winged horse on the hat or cap badge is a very rare surviving motif in female portraiture. Such badges with figures are commonly found on men's hats, prized decorations that were often like a secular impresa or motto, or alternatively, tell us something about the sitter's devotional interest, as in Moretto da Brescia's great full-length portrait of a man in the National Gallery, London, whose enameled gold cap badge shows a St. Christopher. The winged horse has most commonly been identified as Pegasus, who created the Hippocrene spring sacred to Apollo and the Muses. But it has now been suggested that this horse is the related Aganippe, who brought forth a second, gentler spring, aganos meaning gentle, the fount of poetic inspiration, whose image was also evoked by that author, Lucia Bertani. Pietro Bembo, another poet, and perhaps the most important literary figure of his generation, famously employed an image of the winged Pegasus on the reverse of his portrait medal. So taken together, the piume, the winged horse, it is very likely that this portrait alludes to poetry, and perhaps the sitter herself may be a poet. Finally, the elegant band of golden chains that twist through the sitter's slashed sleeves, again, a very rare, if not unique motif for a female portrait, brings to mind many chains that can bind lovers together, especially those called, in the Italian tradition, the lacci d'amore, or love knots, often seen draped around wrists or as larger chains that twist around waists or through interlocked hands. Parmigianino has given these lacci d'amore a new setting. Ermine has suggested that this poetic, romantic, alluring woman may be Veronica Ganbara, the daughter of Count Gianfrancesco Gambara of Brescia, who was born in 1485 and as precociously as 1505 corresponded with the already famous Bembo, whose great dialogue on love, Gli Asolani, had just been published in Venice by Aldus Manutius with a dedication to his own secret love, Lucrezia Borgia. And I'm showing you a page on the left from this very rare edition of the Asolani. In 1508, Veronica married Count Giberto da Correggio. And when their son, Ippolito, was born in 1510, Isabella d'Este, the Marchesa of Mantua, was named one of his godparents. Widowed in 1518, Veronica was left in charge of the small territory of Correggio, the hometown of the famous artist of that name. And this is a good moment to remind you of where all of this is taking place. So we have Mantua, Correggio, Parma, where Parmigianino is living, Bologna, and eventually we're going to move a little further south into the Marche for the town of Urbino. Veronica aligned herself with the empire of Charles V in order to maintain her city's independence. She was to lead a prestigious household in Bologna, which was then governed by her uncle Umberto Gambara. Throughout all these years, she continued to write poetry and to engage in extensive epistolary contact with writers throughout northern Italy. 11 of her letters to the great Venetian author Pietro Aretino, whose portrait by Titian is in the gallery as well, have come down to us. And she wrote a poem on the occasion of the death of Aretino's beloved Angela Tornabene. She was completely linked in to this group. She never lost contact with Bembo and wrote a sonnet on the occasion of his death in 1549. She herself died the following year. I'm not really going to linger over arguments about whether this painting is in fact a portrait, perhaps a rather idealized one, of the accomplished Veronica Ganbara, who would have been about 50 years old when this was painted. But in the ever youthful contest, she had strong competition from her friend Isabella d'Este, who continued to ask artists, including Titian, to rely on her earlier portraits as inspiration over the course of many years. This one was done when Isabella was about 60. But I do just want to mention that descriptions of Veronica in her long widowhood say that she was austere and given to meditation, attracted to the reform of the Catholic Church, and tended towards corpulence. Gambara was very close to Parmigianino's own circles, and that she might have aspired to present herself in the courtly, poetic way that we see given form here is a fascinating possibility. Although the very pointed allure of this woman and those golden lacci d'amore are somehow difficult to reconcile with the serious ruler and widowed matriarch that we know she was. But above all, in this painting, the sitter is shown as someone who communicates with the viewer through her lively gaze and half smile, a communicativeness resulting in a true speaking likeness, the goal of so much Renaissance portraiture. The artist achieves this vivid effect through her pose, her gaze, the attire, her ornament. We are still reacting to the clues that he so brilliantly provided. Now, after this extensive preamble in which I've repeated and responded to the observations that have been made about this painting that is the focus of the exhibition, I want to draw your attention to a small group of other portraits that share a similar artistic language and therefore also act as extraordinary lenses through which to view the societies of these sparkling, small Italian courts in the opening decades of the 16th century. I'll stick close to the household of Isabella d'Este, who lived from 1474 to 1539. She was the daughter of Ercole d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara, and Marchesa of Mantua, following her marriage to Francesco Gonzaga in 1490. Here she is, seen in profile, in one of the most beautiful and lavish medals done in the Renaissance. Partially because she was an extraordinary patron and partially because of the survival and early exploration of the Gonzaga archives. She corresponded with Veronica Ganbara, for example. We have those letters. By circling back to Isabella, we have access to ideas about the importance of portraiture and its various functions in an unparalleled way. Thus, for this gold medal, circled with diamonds spelling out her name and its emblematic reverse, we know all of the following: that Isabella wished to have a medal made in gold by the sculptor Gian Cristoforo Romano, but that initially he was too busy working for her sister, Beatrice d'Este, the Duchess of Milan. Very irritating. That a humanist, also from Correggio, suggested 3 different mottos for the reverse that would refer to her virtues, and then she chose one. And that in 1498, an example of the medal was shown by one poet to another in Ferrara, and that this began a rich season in which poets were inspired to write sonnets about it, one beginning on a medal of the Marquesana. In addition, letters written to Isabella reporting on the reception of the medal bring us deep into the culture of these courts. For example, in 1507, the medal was sent to the, quote, courteous and graceful daughters of the Viceroy of Naples. And it was reported that they looked at it, that lovely medal, at length and kissed it 1,000 times, for they too had heard tell of your standing and merit. Of course, medals were meant to be handled, but the physicality of this response should not be underestimated. Portraits of all types were held, kissed, propped on tables. More complicated was a practical joke played by Isabella's sister-in-law, Elisabetta Gonzaga, the Duchess of Urbino, who you see in this portrait by Raphael, to which we'll return. And I must say, she doesn't look like someone who plays practical jokes to me. But the story goes that when the artist passed through Urbino, trying to deliver a cast of the medal to someone in the vicinity, Elisabetta impeded its arrival, causing the unfortunate intended recipient to write to Isabella asking her where it was. She thought it had been delivered. However, by Isabella's response to him, we know that at a certain point, she was in on the joke. Thus it was that precious objects, distributed with care, meant to be prized and to inspire admiration for the sitter's virtue and her learning, don't forget, with imagery shaped by the sitter herself, as perhaps is the case with the Parmigianino portrait. These could also be part of lively games, whose sense of fun is sometimes elusive to us today. I want to bracket Isabella with portraits of 2 other women with whom she was in contact. In fact, Elisabetta Gonzaga in Urbino, and then Cecilia Gallerani in Milan, focusing on different aspects of their meaning. The portrait of Elisabetta Gonzaga is deeply fascinating and enigmatic. Currently in the Uffizi in Florence, it was part of the ducal collections in Urbino in 1631, and its proper identification was known at that time. Elisabetta, who was born in 1471, was the daughter of the Marchese of Mantua, Federico, so she and Isabella's husband are brother and sister, and was married to Guidobaldo da Montefeltro of Urbino in 1488. Now, the Montefeltro are known to all lovers and admirers of Piero della Francesca, because Guidobaldo is the only child of the famous patron Federico da Montefeltro. Elisabetta and Guidobaldo, sadly, were never able to have children. The Pope offered to dissolve the marriage, but the Duchess was not open to that solution. In the event, their duchy was later made over to a relative, Guidobaldo della Rovere, who in turn married Isabella d'Este's daughter. This is a tangled web. There's no quiz at the end. But what I wanted you to get an idea of is how interlocked these courts actually are. Close family ties. Elisabetta is one of the two women around whom the conversation reported in Baldassare Castiglione's book, The Courtier, revolves. You see him in the great Raphael portrait at the right. Her court was the setting for this defining work of Renaissance literature. The memorable conversations took place around 1507, more or less the period of the Duchess's portrait, and then Castiglione took years to polish them and bring his meditations to fruition. Elisabetta was considered the epitome of elegance and worldly nobility, with a particular appreciation for secular and pastoral poetry. Raphael depicts her frontally with a seriousness of expression that suggests the respect due to her status and character. As with our beautiful Parmigianino, the details of her costume and jewelry are far from casual here, each having significance. As Castiglione himself wrote, external things, le cose extrinsiche, often are testimony to the internal, and clothing plays no small part in displaying the fantasy of the one who wears it. These details are not easy to interpret. Her dark black velvet camura gown, with its pattern of rectangular patches of gold and silver thread, which is similar, in fact, to an elaborate gown that is found in the inventory of her wedding trousseau, and was probably made for her in Florence, as well as the collar with its pseudo-Kufic lettering, are both highly unusual and seem to allude to her interest in riddles and mysterious symbols. But the object that has provoked most debate is the lenza, that is, this fillet that runs across her forehead, in the center of which is a scorpion holding a gem. We're in the decades before the mode for those great balzi, the big headdresses, and instead Elisabetta's long hair falls behind her head, held in place by the transparent veil and this narrow band, but as a means of showing something important to you, the center of the forehead here, and in the Parmigianino. In the book, The Courtier, one of the discussants calls upon his friends to explain why the Duchess is wearing the letter S as a decoration upon her forehead, asking the others to interpret its significance. This question is not answered in the dialogue, but historians have speculated that the ornament was a gift from Castiglione, the writer himself, to the Duchess, perhaps as a sign of his attachment. Others have suggested that it had a chivalric connection to the Gonzaga court of her childhood. How does it, or does that S that is debated in the book, relate to this painting's Scorpio, whose meanings could range from that of the zodiac to the more immediate and visceral associations of the creature itself, protective of her but threatening to those who try to approach too closely, perhaps? Castiglione, in fact, had an amorous relationship with the Duchess of the courtly and probably platonic kind. In 1506, when Guidobaldo da Montefeltro had sent the writer and diplomat to London on an official trip, Castiglione wrote the first of 2 sonnets addressed to Elisabetta, one specifically evoking the beauty of her visage. It begins, "Ecco la bella fronte." Here is the beautiful face, her eyes, the lips formed in paradise, and so on, and ending with a lament about his exile and separation from her. He was sent home from England in honor with a gold chain formed from linked S's from the British court, Did Castiglione imagine one of them placed on his beloved's forehead? According to a very old tradition, going back to the author's daughter-in-law, the sonnets were rediscovered in 1560, along with the Duchess's portrait by Raphael, both hidden behind a large mirror that, quote, could be opened and closed by anyone who knew the trick. And this is a well-known device for secret keepsakes in the Renaissance. I'm showing you such a mirror here, which you can pull it apart to reveal secret recesses behind. Thus, the poems were indivisibly linked to the portrait, and the two meant to be considered together. Both were kept privately. The great Raphael scholar John Sherman believed both the story of the hidden poems and that the portrait in question was that now in the Uffizi. If that is so, with this painting we have two mysteries. The symbol that is displayed so prominently on the sitter's forehead that perhaps elaborates on another that a great author had invented for her literary portrait, and its secret location with the most private function possible. Poetry, painting, symbolic detail displayed but not easily elucidated. These are elements of many of the greatest portraits of this moment. Many of you probably know the basic facts of Leonardo's portrait of Cecilia Gallerani, often called the Lady with an Ermine, which is a defining portrait of the late 15th century. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, its spatially complex pose ultimately lies behind that of Parmigianino's Schiava Turca. It depicts a celebrated young beauty at the Milanese court, also a poet and a wit, who became Ludovico Maria Sforza's mistress at the age of 15 and bore him a son not long after, in 1491. A sonnet written about the portrait makes a complex argument about her natural beauty and its preservation in art, ending with these lines: "Everyone who sees her thus, though too late to see her living, will say, 'This suffices for us now to understand what is nature and what art.'" As with other portraits we've been examining, her costume, jewelry, pose, and gaze are fundamental to the work's appearance and message. Here, the most ostentatious detail is the white ermine, which has multiple meanings, cleverly and simultaneously playing on Cecilia's own surname in Greek, Gale or weasel, her lover Ludovico's participation in the elite order of the ermine, and therefore as a symbolic stand-in for him, and the understanding of white ermines, both as symbols of purity and in connection with childbirth. I want to concentrate on the social and cultural meanings of this painting without losing sight of its transcendent beauty, by bringing the discussion back to Isabella d'Este. Ludovico il Moro had no intention of marrying Cecilia Gallerani, despite her many qualities, and indeed was betrothed to Beatrice d'Este, Isabella's sister, seen here in another breathtaking work of art, her sculpted portrait by Gian Cristoforo Romano. Although in different media, these two works, done at about the same moment, each poignantly display their sitter's strengths and weaknesses. The rather round-cheeked Beatrice could not compete with Cecilia's sleek beauty. And indeed, at first, Cecilia also had the upper hand in that the ermine, Ludovico himself, was in her arms. In fact, his intense involvement with her caused him to delay his marriage more than once, while claiming that the delay was instead due to his intense preparations for the nuptials. Everyone saw through this ruse. Beatrice's strengths were in her lineage and societal role, and these are spelled out in the delicate heraldic play on the bib of her garment, in which the family's Este diamond ring encircles the Sforza emblem known as a burato, a cloth sieve held in two hands. The sieve dusts the flower bloom below it, simulating pollination, a clear allusion to fertility in the marriage. And then immediately to the left, in the bib, is the most delicate detail of a pin tucked into Beatrice's bodice. Does this refer to the domestic order she would bring to Ludovico's household? The antagonism between these two very young women actually went on for quite a long time. Cecilia continued to live in rooms at the Castello Sforzesco even after the marriage, and her baby, Cesare, was born there. Beatrice used her ally, the Ferrarese ambassador, to put pressure on Ludovico to remove Cecilia, and there was a particularly ugly moment when the two women discovered that the Duke had given them the same dress, a blow to Beatrice, who was passionately involved in fashion, indeed was known as a novarum vestium inventrix, the inventor of new fashion. And then, in 1492, the situation was resolved. Ludovico organized Cecilia's marriage to a courtier, and she became the Countess Bergamini, with her own properties in Milan and elsewhere, continuing to entertain and, importantly, to write poetry. She took the portrait with her. Perhaps it had always been meant as a gift to her. In any case, it became an adornment of her new home. Beatrice went on to become equally important in Ludovico's eyes, and although she died tragically young in 1497, aged 22, and Ludovico wrote a beautiful letter actually lamenting her loss, she had made an impact on the court through her presence and her style. Isabella and Beatrice, sisters, remained very close through visits and letters. Thus, it is surprising to learn that very soon after Beatrice's death, Isabella wrote to Cecilia Gallerani to ask for the loan of the celebrated Leonardo painting. She wished to compare the portrait that Leonardo had done from life with other such works by the Venetian Giovanni Bellini. Very interesting moment, that. Cecilia immediately wrote back to the Marchesa, offering to send it, but warning Isabella that she no longer resembled the image, so much so that if you saw it and me together, there is no one who would judge it meant for me. Isabella also gave refuge to Cecilia and her son when they fled Milan upon the arrival of the invading French in 1499. As one scholar has noted, Isabella was practical. She accepted Cecilia as a, quote, consequence of court life. But I'm sure that for Isabella, Leonardo's portrait by that time had meaning that went well beyond the person represented in it. We know that Isabella always hoped for a painted portrait of herself by Leonardo. In the end, he did 2 portrait drawings of her. One was given away by her husband, probably leaving her furious, and the other stayed with the artist and is now the great drawing in the Louvre. It's this drawing in the Louvre. Isabella understood that Leonardo had shifted the aesthetics of portraiture in fundamental ways through his increasing interest in movement, here seen in the contrapposto of Cecilia's twisting body, the incredible delicacy of the fall of light that suggests flesh and muscle and bone, in the suggestion of states of mind, and in the poem we're told about this painting, we're told that she seems to listen and not speak, an even more subtle reactive pose. And as Luc Sisson has noted, in the ability of art to preserve beauty and halt time, definitely of interest to Isabella. In considering the portraits that she wanted for herself, Isabella sought in 1498 for this most modern and artistically innovative approach. This is extremely interesting to me because the same underlying dynamic occurred about 15 years later in the riveting story of Isabella's portrait commission of her son and heir, Federico, which begins in 1510 and ends, well, either in 1513 or 1519, depending on what you think of endings. And some of you may know parts of this story from our Portraiture exhibition at the Met 2 years ago. I'll rush through the beginning of the tale. In 1510, the 10-year-old Federico was sent to the papal court of Julius II as a hostage in exchange for the release of his father, Marchese Francesco, a soldier who had been captured by the Venetians during the politically tragic War of the League of Cambrai. Although Isabella knew that residence at the Vatican would be of potential value to her son, there's more on that to come, she also knew she would miss him and wished to have a portrait to ease her sense of loss during his absence. As Federico was traveling through Bologna on his way to Rome, Francesco Francia, the principal artist active in Bologna, was asked to paint his portrait, which we know now is this appealing work at the Metropolitan Museum. After 12 days of work, the portrait was sent to Isabella in Mantua, but as was so typical of her, she was dissatisfied with one detail, finding the hair too blonde, and she sent it back to the artist for correction. And as a parenthesis here, I can't help but share with you the fact that while Renaissance women were constantly trying to dye their hair to make it lighter and more blonde, men wanted theirs to be darker. And Isabella herself wrote to the court in Milan in 1496 asking for secrets for darkening hair. Okay, they darken the hair. Finally, after a notorious incident in which the portrait was spirited off to Rome in the papal entourage, prompting outraged letters from the Marchesa and desperate moves by her agents in Bologna and Rome, Isabella finally got it back in very late 1510. Such memory portraits were at the very core of Renaissance portrait practice. Husbands with paintings of their wives and children when they were absent, and Francesco Gonzaga himself had such portraits with him when he was imprisoned in Venice. Wives of husbands, as you can see in this, where they're actually brought together in one canvas, children, their fathers. There's no more beautiful expression of this idea than that involving Raphael's great Baldassare Castiglione. We last met the author and diplomat during his years in the orbit of the court of Urbino, but when he returned to his native Mantua to work for the Gonzaga family, he married Ippolita Torello, with whom he had a son. In 1519, Baldassare was sent back to Rome on a diplomatic trip, leaving this portrait with Ippolita and writing an elegy on his departure. The poem is written in Ippolita's voice, and it discusses the consolation that the painted portrait brought her. Only your portrait, by Raphael's hand, bringing back your features, comes near to relieving my sorrows. I make tender approaches to it. I smile, I joke or speak, just as if it could give me an answer. Some lines further on allude to a parent-child separation. Your son recognizes his father and greets him with childish talk. We can imagine the satisfaction that Isabella must have felt seeing this gentle portrait of her son. His delicately painted face, unusually gracious for a work of this period, his luxuriant yet simple black clothing and hat with its own miniature hat badge, the filigree of gold and precious stones and pearl of his pendant necklace, and his right hand holding the small, beautifully crafted dagger that alluded to his status. Yet, little more than a year later, she gave the portrait away. And I want to linger on two aspects of this unanticipated decision because it's so revealing about the functions of portraits at this time within a courtly setting and the rapidly shifting expectations of their patrons. Isabella sent Federico's portrait to a courtier and poet in her own hometown, Ferrara. His name was Gianfrancesco Zaninello. Several months earlier, he had sent her a superbly bound manuscript dedicated to her of a group of sonnets written by the poet Antonio Camelli called Il Pistoia, whom Isabella knew very well. She was very impressed by this gift. She called it a gran tesoro, a great treasure. And she asked her agent in Ferrara how she should reciprocate. He boldly recommended that she send this portrait, as well as her own portrait that had been done by the same artist, Francia, some months earlier in Bologna. She did it. When the paintings arrived, Zaninello described the portrait of Federico accurately as a delicate effigie, a delicate figure, and told Isabella that he was hanging the two paintings together like Venus and Cupid. Not long afterwards, she also sent him a portrait of the poet Pistoia, whose poetry was the origin of the whole exchange. Why did Isabella so blithely relinquish this painting over which she had raised such a fuss and which was meant to have such a private meaning? I think there are two answers to this puzzling question. First, I think she understood the impact that these dynastic portraits could have in a new courtly setting. She was very aware of what happened at the court in Ferrara, and she wanted to be in the forefront of its members' minds. There are absolutely fantastic letters that describe how Zaninello organized entire dinners around the surprise arrival of these portraits. People gathered to eat and then discussed them. Isabella's Ferrarese correspondent even joked about the cost of these dinners to poor Zaninello, who described himself as living in a hovel, by the way, which cannot have been true. These costs were bound to escalate when Federico's portrait was added to the mix, and more entertainments would have to be organized. The three paintings given as gifts by Isabella formed part of this intriguing early gallery of portraits, whose display was of great social importance to their recipient, but to the donor as well. Even more than this, Isabella also realized that Federico's life had been transformed at the court of Julius II in Rome, here as depicted by Raphael. And she and her husband were developing a different conception of the youth, and therefore had new ambitions for his representation. It's hard to imagine it, but the clear-eyed youth really made an impression at this most sophisticated papal court. We first hear of him trying to buy the statue of the Laocoon for his mother. When the folly of that became clear to him, he instead asked the great goldsmith, Cristoforo Foppa, known as Caradosso, to design a hat badge of the sculpture to be sent to Mantua. Later, Isabella was told that the Pope wished to have Federico's portrait included in the ongoing decoration of his private apartments, the famous stanze, on which Raphael was at work. Federico also took his uncle, Duke Alfonso d'Este, up on the scaffolding of the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo was at work. And in fact, Federico felt much more comfortable around the Pope than Alfonso did at that moment. Julius was also personally involved with Federico's education, asking Marco Fabio Calvo, the author of the first illustrated book on ancient Rome, and you see an illustration of it on the screen at right, to act as the young boy's instructor. The Pope was very concerned about Federico's attire at court and ordered new armor to be made for him. A series of letters show that the 12-year-old was to wear this armor as a member of the Papal Guardia for the opening of the Lateran Council in 1512. And this ceremonial armor, which included a doublet of cloth that had belonged to Cesare Borgia and must have been absolutely over the top, was described in detail in a whole series of letters. With this ceremonial garb, he was meant to wear another cap of black velvet with a cap badge depicting Hercules. These berette with badges were always spaces of symbolic decoration for this court, as when Federico appeared at the Church of Santa Maria del Popolo with one decorated with diamonds, forming the letters ACRV, devised by his mother and meaning Amor caro ritorna vivo. Makes you think of her portrait medal with the diamonds around. When we think of what all of this meant to his parents, his growth, success, new roles, new attire, and then think of the simultaneous drumbeat in these letters about the quality of Raphael's work and the extraordinary artistic environment at the papal court, we are less surprised when in May 1512, Isabella writes that she's given up Francia's portrait and wants a new and more beautiful one. She now wanted Raphael himself to commemorate Federico wearing the luxurious clothing and the armor newly produced for the great historical event of the council. And as I cannot show you that picture, I wanted to illustrate something to give you an idea of the prominent place that such elaborate clothing and ceremonial armor could play in portraits of noble youths at this moment. I'm showing you the young Francesco Maria della Rovere in a portrait probably painted by Giorgione. And you see the della Rovere symbol of the oak leaves that is bent around the curve of the gleaming helmet. In January 1513, Raphael was very engrossed in creating a charcoal drawing of Federico in the beautiful clothing and cap that had been sent to him as props for the purpose. There's a humorous passage in a letter from an agent to Francesco in Mantua in which the youth is described as finally breaking away from the tedious sitting, jumping on his horse in full regalia and galloping off down the street. Raphael completed a great deal of this commission, but under external pressure. When Pope Julius was on his deathbed in mid-February 1513, the artist abruptly returned the clothing props, saying that he no longer had the mind, il cervello, to work on the portrait. It's possible that the artist realized that the boy would soon be sent home to Mantua and that his task would therefore become more complicated. Or, rather, that he no longer felt the same sense of obligation now that Julius, who had so wholeheartedly accepted the youth into his court, was no longer part of the equation. This was a great disappointment to Isabella and Francesco. When we consider the portraits that Raphael carried out around 1512, 1513, such as the sublime Donna Velata in Florence, it is abundantly clear that his work would have represented the future and modernity vis-a-vis Francia's delicate figure. The monumentality, the sense of physical presence, the spatial complexity, and the idealization of Raphael's portraiture would have presented Federico as a newly mature youth of stature and even grandeur. The more painterly quality of Raphael's brushwork in just these years would have brought the surfaces of Federico's clothing, the damasks, the golden-threaded berretta, and the reflective armor alive in a way that few other artists could have achieved. The same subtle sense of life that Isabella sought in Leonardo's portraiture, knowing that she would find it in the Cecilia Gallerani, is what she now sought again some 15 years later in Raphael. Federico came home, becoming Marquis of Mantua in 1519, at about which time there was a rather remarkable coda to this story. You see the portrait of him some 10 years later on your right. Baldassare Castiglione was a member of the Gonzaga court, as I previously mentioned, and thus it was for Federico that he was sent out to Rome in 1519 on his diplomatic mission. One of his jobs was to find the half-completed Raphael portrait. Enough of it had been painted to make the work desirable, and indeed a noble Roman family, the Colonna, possessed it. Castiglione approached them, asking that Cardinal Pompeo Colonna be made aware that Federico was trying to obtain the portrait of himself as a boy, quote, made when he went to the council, with Pope Julius of blessed memory, and was in armor. And one of Castiglione's letters reporting about these developments to the court is now preserved in the Pierpont Morgan Library. It's fabulous. You can sit and have it in your hand. When told that the cardinal would not part with the work for any money, Castiglione proposed that he might be induced to send it instead as part of a gift exchange. The final agreement was that Colonna would send the Raphael portrait and Federico would send in return a falcon. So it was done. Although lost now, the picture did make its way into the sitter's hands. A great portrait of Federico, by then Duke of Mantua, was painted by Titian, who was in Mantua in April 1529, finishing it. It's that which you see. Another, now lost, was painted the same year with him in armor. Federico deeply admired Titian for his skills in evoking a sitter's actual presence. When the Duke received a portrait of Pietro Aretino by Titian in 1527, he said that it looked, quote, so naturalistic that excluding nature itself, it is impossible that someone else could have done it better. To define the Duke's stature, Titian shows him 3/4 length in luxurious clothing with rich golden embroidery and a gold and lapis lazuli rosary. His hand rests on the hilt of his sword, and the somewhat fawning Maltese dog takes up a classical idea as a creature that immediately recognizes his master, thus affirming the truthfulness of the depiction. This painting was probably commissioned with the idea of presenting it and himself at the time of his betrothal to Margherita Paleologa. Thus, in the lineage of the portraits of Federico that we've discussed, the first marked his departure from home, aged 10, the second, his full participation in the papal court of Julius II, the third, his matrimony, and the fourth, that in armor, his role as a military commander. Each had to communicate something very precise about him. As John Sherman once noted, the enormous changes that took place in portraiture in Italy between about 1490 and 1530, we can think of them here as between Leonardo and Parmigianino, involved above all an increased communicativeness. Between them, artists, patrons, sitters, and poets sought to develop a mode of portraiture that communicated with the viewer on many levels, defining the sitter's position in society, but more than that, evoking personalities, interests, and even secrets. Nowhere was this truer than in the courts of northern and central Italy. When Parmigianino came to paint this portrait of a woman, he was able to evoke so much about her life and culture through his presentation of her. Her communicativeness is perhaps her most distinctive feature, engaging us in a way that continues to give us pleasure some 4.5 centuries later. Thank you very much.